Hey, what is going on, guys? Today we are continuing with our Perlisten R series. If you didn't catch the previous video, I had an opportunity to go over to Matt Mormon's house. He's got a full Perlisten R series system in his living room. A lot of you guys do not have dedicated theater rooms, and so I wanted to feature a room that is more common to us because you don't have a dedicated theater room, and I thought that'd be super relatable. So in this video, I want to talk and dive deep into the Perlisten R7t. So this is Perlisten's flagship tower speaker in the R series. Now, before we dive into that specific model, I want to give you a little backstory on the R series. So Perlisten, about 5 years ago, came onto the scene. Nobody had ever heard of them. And they came out with a series called the S series. So they started with their flagship. This is a very high-end, gorgeous finish, just super top notch, massive output. And they were the first company to ever reach Dominus level. And truthfully, when I first heard about this brand and I heard this THX Dominus, I'm like, they just made that up. No, it really was a thing. I'd heard of THX Select, THX Ultra 2. So these are certifications that manufacturers can achieve from THX. It's like a stamp of approval. And a lot of times it has to do with things like low distortion, output for a certain volume in a room. And so if you wanted to achieve larger volume, you would have to, you wanted that higher THX certification. Well, when I heard about THX Dominus, I'm like, okay, they made that up just to make them sound special. No, there is a THX Dominus. And so this is a massive room. I believe it's 6,500 cubic feet. That's a big room. And so anything that's able to hit THX Dominus is able to have that much output to fill that size room, but also with those things, like I said, lower distortion and so forth. So Perlisten came out with the S series first, but again, it was their flagship, beautiful finish. But for a lot of us, it was unattainable. When you're talking about $12,000 for a single tower, that's a lot of money for most of us. And so over the years, after Perlisten fully developed that entire S series, they began to introduce this new series called the R series. Now, the R series comes in about half the cost of the S series. And so you may be thinking, well, Michael, yeah, they just cut corners and they use cheaper components. One thing I really love and appreciate about Perlisten is they take the same technology in their flagship, in the S series, and that technology has trickled down into their what I would consider their mid tier. And then they have one tier that they just announced recently called the A series. And so, but that technology has trickled down to the R series. And so you've got DPC. This is, and we'll talk about it more when we look at the DPC array. But this is a technology that they said, look, we want to make sure that that same technology, because that's kind of like the heartbeat of what Perlisten's about in their speakers. We want to make sure that that's implemented in the R series too. And so some of the things that you're going to miss out on are those things like those really high-end, beautiful finishes on the cabinet. And so there's some costs that they can reduce the price by not having these kind of exotic finishes and having multiple different versions of that, and produce a speaker that sounds incredible, but also looks gorgeous. Let's go ahead and flip over to the website and take a look at the Perlisten R7t. All right, so here we have the Perlisten R7t floor standing speaker. So this comes in at roughly $5,500 per speaker. We only have one finish. And so I mentioned to you earlier that this is one way that Perlisten is able to help keep the cost down of this series, is because they don't have different iterations of this. They don't have to manufacture different styles and different finishes. And so here you can see, you can click on each one of these and get a really high resolution image. And we'll take a look at some B-roll of Matt's speakers. They do have speaker grills. I didn't have them in Matt's living room, but these are metal grills. And so if you want to protect your drivers and the tweeters, you can absolutely use these, and they're very, very solid. But these are extra. If you want those, you have to buy those separately. Again, another way that Perlisten said, hey, look, We're going to help bring this cost down. And by doing so, by removing those grills from being included, we can help keep the cost down quite a bit. Now, when you take a look at the Perlisten R series, they look gorgeous. I love the fact that you've got these nice rounded edges on the front of the speaker. You've got this beautiful high gloss finish, piano black finish. And we've got this beautiful baffle, these rounded edges that encompass each driver as well as the center DPC array. Down at the very bottom of the speaker, you've got this big, massive steel plate. So this steel plate offers a couple of things. Number one, it offers stability. One thing that we all worry about is when we have people over, guests over, maybe you have young children. Like in my case, I've got a grandson that's 3 years old. And the last thing I want is him walking over to my beautiful speakers and pushing on it and knocking this thing over. That base plate allows this speaker to be extremely stable because it's got so much weight on the bottom, but it's also wide enough that it keeps it very, very balanced. You'll also notice a couple of things down at the bottom. Now, I really like the styling of the feet here. We've got this two-tone going on. So we've got black and copper. It looks really gorgeous, really high-end, even for their mid-tier speaker in the R series. Down at the bottom of that, you see this little tip that has a bronze spike on it. And so that's great if you have carpet. So again, this just adds additional stability and it adds some separation between or isolation between the floor and the speaker itself. You'll see there's a little hole going through that. That's to allow you to insert a tool so you can tighten that. And Perlisten includes that in the packaging. Now, if you have hardwood floor or maybe tile, you can simply remove that tip and then the bottom of that puck is rubber, and so you don't have to worry about damaging your flooring. So now let's go ahead and take a look at the specs here. The enclosure type is a four-way bass reflex acoustic suspension. When we're looking at the drivers, it is a DPC array. And again, that is called directivity pattern control. Now, let me just spend a little bit of time talking about the DPC array because that is an integral part of the Perlisten S series as well as the R series. And so when I was talking with Eric and Dan from Perlisten, they began to explain to me what the DPC, like one of the main goals of it. So in a room, your acoustics of that room can greatly impact how well a speaker performs. And so you've got dispersion on any speaker. And so sound doesn't just come straight out of the speaker, it gets dispersed into the room. And so sound is going to reflect off your sidewalls and your floor and your ceiling. So one of the ways that Perlisten has mitigated those reflections is with a dynamic pattern control. They've limited the vertical dispersion of that speaker. And so what that means is the speaker is aimed kind of at the center where your ears are, not to be able to reflect off your ceiling and flooring. So this minimizes and kind of removes two of those reflections. And what that's going to allow is that speaker, whether it's a center channel or a surround speaker, or in this case, the tower speakers, it's going to allow that speaker to play cleaner and just have a better sound because it doesn't have additional reflections from the room. So in the DPC array, you've got three speakers. You've got a 1-inch or a 26 millimeter silk dome tweeter in the center. And then flanking that are two other 1-inch mid-range drivers. And even as you see, there's a rounded edge on those mid-range drivers. I thought that was just to make it look cool. And again, I had a conversation with the engineers at Perlisten, and they're like, no, Michael, we actually designed that with intentionality. Perlisten has always been about measurements first. They want to make sure that everything they do in the design phase isn't just aesthetics. They want to make sure that it's performing to its absolute best and optimal possibility. And so by making that round, it actually measured better and cleaner than it did if that were to be straight up. Now, above the DPC array and below the DPC array, we've got 4 woofers. And so these are 165 millimeters or 6.5 inches. So these woofers are going to provide solid output, solid bass extension down to roughly about 27 hertz. Now, of course, I always recommend running a subwoofer, even if you've got a two-channel system. If you were running just the R7Ts with, in a two-channel setup, I still recommend get one of their subwoofers. It's going to greatly add a lot of impact and fill in those lower octaves that you might be missing if you're just listening with two speakers. But especially for movies, because we've got content that extends down to 20 hertz and even well below 20 hertz in certain movies. The R7T has a sensitivity of 90 dB with 2.83 volts at 1 meter. So what does that mean? What that means is Perlisten placed a voltage. They sent 2.83 volts to the speaker. And at 1 meter, when they placed the microphone 3 feet away at 1 meter, how loud did that speaker, play? And with an SPL meter, sound pressure level meter, it read 90 dB. And so what this means is the lower that number, the more power you really need to feed them for them to be able to reach reference volume. So every doubling of amplification increases that volume 3 dB. So if, let's just say I'm going to use 1 volt, I'm sorry, not 1 volt, 1 watt instead of the 2.83, just to make it easier to understand. So if we fed a speaker 1 watt and that speaker on the SPL meter read 90 dB, to get it 3 decibels louder, we'd need to double that amplification. Now we're going from 1 watt to 2 watt. So 2 watts, we'd be at 93 dB. 4 watts, 96 dB. 8 watts, 99 dB. You get the picture. And so the more power you feed these, the louder they can get, but you have to keep doubling that wattage. And so at 90 dB, I would highly recommend running an external amplifier with these. I think you're going to get a lot more impact. You're going to get a lot more dynamics out of these, and they're just going to perform optimally if you pair this with an external amplifier. My recommendation, I always like 200 watts a channel. If you can get 300 watts or more, that's great. But 200 watts would be absolutely sufficient for these. Now, you can run these with an AVR, but again, I think you're going to get much more performance out of them with an external amplifier since they don't have super high sensitivity in their rating. The impedance on these speakers are 4 ohms. And so what that means is it's going to pull more power from your amplifier. A lot of times in an amplifier, especially an external amplifier, let's say for instance, it's rated at 200 watts into 8 ohms. Typically in 4 ohms, that amplifier is going to be providing about 300 watts. So just know it's going to be pulling more power from your amplifier. Where this is a big deal is on an AVR. On an AVR, if all of your speakers are 4 ohms, it's really taxing that AVR. Again, another reason why I'd recommend getting an external amplifier. That way you can make sure you're getting solid amplification to each speaker in your system. The R7T has a frequency response of 27 hertz up to 32 kilohertz. Now, most of the time we can't hear up to 32 kilohertz, but it's good to know that this speaker has the ability to perform at that level. Typically, in-room response, you're going to get down to about 19 hertz. Now, the reason why we see 2 different frequency responses here, you see the 27 hertz for the frequency response, and then below that, typical in-room, it says bass reflex 19 hertz. The reason why there's 2 of them is the 27 hertz was basically when they took this speaker, put it inside an anechoic chamber and measure this, or maybe they used the Klippel near field scanner to measure this. What this does is take the room out of the equation. When you don't have reflections, then typically that number is going to be a lot higher. It's not going to dig as low. But then you place that into a room, and now your acoustics, you can get what we call room gain. So that extension, you can begin to get lower frequencies when you place that speaker in a room. So they're saying that it measures down to about 19 hertz. That's what you can expect more than likely inside your room. The dimension of this tower is 1268 by 230 by 350 millimeters or 49.9 inches by 9 inches by 13.7 inches. Although not a massive speaker, it's still a pretty significant sized tower. The weight on the R7t is 48 kilograms or 105.6 pounds. So this is not a cheaply built speaker. This thing is inert. It's rock solid. Perlisten has done a great job at providing some internal structure that keeps that cabinet from resonating. And then of course we've got that steel plate on the bottom as well, making that a really, really solid foundation. Recommended amplifier power, they recommend anywhere between 100 watts to 400 watts continuous. And again, that's my preference. If you've got something around 200 watts per channel, that's going to be a phenomenal pairing with this. If you got a little bit more power, that's great as well. How loud is the R7t capable of? The SPL capability at 1 meter, so that's when they take the microphone and measure it at 1 meter, it was able to achieve 116 decibel peak. Now 116 dB is very loud. I don't recommend listening at that levels, but having a speaker that's capable higher than reference is always a good thing because you control the volume and make sure that it doesn't damage your hearing. So the certification, again, this is both THX Dominus as well as THX Ultra certified. And again, that just means that this speaker is capable of providing adequate sound and adequate sound pressure level in a very, very large room. And again, there's only one finish, and that is the piano black. I'm super excited about this series. Again, when they came out with the S series, that definitely wasn't for everybody. A lot of us looked at that and said, man, I wish I could have that, but that's way, way beyond my budget. And so to have a system, to have a speaker package, and we're going to talk about each one of these speakers and subwoofers in the R series, but to have a package, to have a series that is much, much more attainable, but still preserves that high fidelity, preserves the aesthetic beauty, and preserves that great low distortion and just measures extremely well. I think they look great. They sound incredible, and yet they're half the cost of the S series. And so if you don't have the budget for their absolute flagship, I think you definitely ought to consider checking out the R series. Now, of course, we've got access to all of the R series, even if you don't see them on the website. So if they're not available for purchase directly on obsessedhometheater.com, you can always hit me up at youthman@obsessedhometheater.com. Tell me what you're looking for. I'd be glad to have a conversation with you. Well, guys, I appreciate you watching. Hope you enjoyed this series. We're going to continue on through the entire Perlisten R series lineup. I hope you guys have an incredible week. God bless, and I'll catch you in the next video.